Welcome, 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 welcome. One more welcome for everybody up north in Canada. We have a very special treat. We have an international interview. Well, it's Canada, our friends to the north. Uh, so before we got started, I had a friend from Canada. Can you confirm if this is true? He said there was I'm not making this up. Do you guys have a reserve of maple syrup, like a bank for that?
Oh, yeah, we do. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Just in case.
Yes.
Yeah.
I heard, he goes, this is the most Canadian robbery ever. Robbers robbed the Canadians' maple syrup bank, and they left a note saying, sorry. Okay.
I don't know if I can't fact check that, but
Okay.
that would sound very Canadian.
Okay. All right. We'll leave it there. Thank you for coming out with us today. We'll get to that in a second. Thank you for coming out. This is part of our continuing series where we talk to reporters, writers, academics, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, as long as you can get thoughtful opinions packaged directly to you, the public, unedited and unaltered, so that you could do this thing that was popular back when I was a teenager called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back. Maybe it's part of a bygone era. With us today, it's our privilege to have Dr. Ann E. Wilson. She's a professor and lab director at Laurier, Inspiring Lives. It's a university in Canada. If you didn't know, there's the maple leaf. She's a professor of psychology at the psychology department at Wilfrid Laurier University. Received an honors BA at Mount Allison University in 94, a PhD in social psychology from the University of Waterloo in 2000. Came to Laurier in 2000. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Social Psychology and Fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, SCIFAR, Successful Societies Program. Gratefully knowledge funding from SSHRC, MyTax, CFI, the CRC program, and SCIFAR. Some of the awards and achievements: Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Successful Societies Program, member of the College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists, Royal Society of Canada, that's very prestigious. Fellow Canadian Psychological Association, Waterloo Regional Record, top 40 under 40. Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Social Psychology, Fellow Society for Experimental Social Psychology, and Premier's Research Excellence Award. Premier is their word for, I believe, president. I am a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University and part of Laurier's social psychology program. Fascinated by people and how they behave, think, and understand themselves and their social worlds. Fully funded by these organizations. I'm also a fellow Successful Societies program of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. Some of my specific research interests include identity over time. How do people construct their temporal extended identity? My lab, we think about identity at the level of individual, as well as relational and collective identity, identities that come from relationships and group memberships. And each of these kinds of identity cannot exist only in the present. They have a past and a future. How people reconstruct and remember their personal and collective past. That's very relevant to what we're talking about today. Beliefs about the nature of change. People can be powerfully affected by their implicit beliefs or lay theories about how the world works. People diverge in their beliefs about whether people, groups, or particular attributes are changeable over time or are fixed and stable. My research in the labs are investigating how these beliefs alter people's memories, predictions, and judgments. Talked a lot about that in this series. Motivation and future goal pursuit. How do individuals' representations of the past and future influence their motivation to pursue long-term goals in the face of immediate crisis, costs, or temptations? Also talked a lot about that. The psychology of time. People's subjective experience of time can often differ markedly from calendar or clock time. This points in time of the past or future may seem close or distant regardless of their actual proximity. We've talked a lot about that. Sociocultural influences on the self. How does society's cultural norms affect self-appraisals, behavior, and relationships? In my lab, we've examined sociocultural norms for ideal physical appearance and how they influence women and men's self-image and belief about their social worth. For example, we find that women who are exposed to societal messages about beauty and thinness base their self-worth on appearance and are more attuned to beauty as a measure of their social worth. This can have disastrous implications for the security in close relationships. And this was the series where I found the professor. But before we get to that, let's check in and see how we did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Do we need to correct anything with the record or your academic relations?
No, that sounds all great. The one thing that I guess didn't get highlighted there is my more recent research on political polarization, but you can also tell that my expertise is a little bit more wide ranging than that. So I haven't been doing only research on politics. It's one of the things that I've gotten into in more recent years. Other thing I'll just correct because of
Please.
the Canadian context is it's Laurier, not Laurier, and that's just the French influence, the pronunciation.
Laurier.
Yep.
I actually knew a guy named Laurier. That was Laurier. All right. His name was Mark Laurier, but Laurier. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? I want to make sure we get the record straight. Anything else that we need to correct?
No, it's all good.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's get right into it. This was a conference about political polarization in 2023. The U.S. is experiencing unprecedented levels of political polarization relative to the past few decades, especially in terms of effective polarization, something we've talked in the series a lot about, or feelings of dislike and distrust towards members of the opposing political party. In this winter talk series, we will hear from experts across disciplines in order to better understand why political polarization is so high and what, if anything, can we do about it. And this had a lot of people in it. David Dunning, Ann Wilson is here. Shanto Iyengar is very famous in this. Della Belladessari has been famous for a long time. Eli Finkel and Yapach Lokis is also very, very famous in this arena. What was this conference about, and why was it being held? And before you answer, if you could talk not only as an academic, but just somebody living in the North American continent the last 10 to 15 years with two working eyeballs. And pretend as though I've been in a cave for the last decade. What's going on in America? Why is this a worthwhile conference in 2023? How come they got so many professors from so many places to come together to discuss this? Is this an important topic? Is it worth discussing? Why now?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The conference is, I guess, rather than calling it a conference, it's sort of a talk series. So, unfortunately, we weren't all speaking to one another, right? We all came one week after another, and it was something that the University of Michigan was then doing for a full term. And so, the reason that they chose this topic, it was actually organized by a professor named Amy Gordon, who is also interested in topics related to polarization. And in fact, she does research on relationships as well. So she's interested in thinking about how our political differences might also be somewhat connected to, or you could understand some of the ways our politics resemble relationship problems, right? So she put together this wonderful list of people to come and speak about this topic so that they could really get their hands around an important issue. And I mean, the broader question that you asked, though, is like, why now? Why is this something that we're talking about? And I'm sure you can see both in the scholarly literature as well as in public discourse that people are talking lots about polarization, and there's a good reason for it. It's very evident that polarization has been on the rise. There's a lot of disagreement about exactly what that looks like, what's the source of the polarization, whether or not the polarization is all real or if some of it is imagined. But there's certainly something going on. And a large part of it, whether or not we're necessarily as far apart on some things as we think we are, whatever's going on is certainly leading to a lot of animosity, a lot of vitriol, even dehumanization. So people have come to really see their political opponents as morally bad people in a lot of cases, right? So, when you see a problem like this, it leads a lot of scholars to say, gosh, is there something that I might be able to do to try to understand this better, contribute to our knowledge about an important social topic? And I think the other thing that attracts a lot of scholars to this is, if you're interested in other major social issues, then polarization can sometimes be just one of the things that really stymies our ability to get anything done, right? So before I started working on polarization, one of the topics I was interested in was psychology of climate change. And I kept finding that the small little sort of psychological and cognitive things that I was focusing on, how do people think about time and their future, and do they conceptualize, the long-term outcomes and impacts of some of the decisions and behaviors that they're doing now. Those are all useful. But what kept coming back over and over again was, gosh, we can make tiny little tweaks there, but the politics was so large, right? So the political division was so large that these small tweaks were really only just like little drops in the bucket. So that was also one of the things that drew me to be interested in political polarization more generally, because it just seems like it has created a stalemate in a lot of really important social issues.
I'd like to come back to, I have many questions, but I'd like to come back to this one, just because this is something that I've basically come to conclude on my own. I'm still withholding my conclusions until I do all the interviews and finish all the reading. I mean, we're getting there. We got this done, but we got more coming. But it's something I'm feeling like might be a conclusion that I reach. And one of the issues, I got into this space because I didn't find the media doing a good job of interviewing enough people about political polarization. There was basically one national public review. It's an NPR. It's one of our most trusted, non-biased. Well, conservatives think it's biased, but it's generally non-biased. They generally try to do just a straight job, no politics. They try. I'm sure other people will disagree with that. But they did an article on political polarization. They said, well, we talked to 3 professors, and they were all from basically one coastal or 2 coastal universities. And none of them were conservative, and none of them were from the Midwest. And they all said, yeah, we agreed. This is why polarization is here, and here's the causes. And then they wrapped it up and they go, see, thorough review. And I'm going, there was no conservatives, there was no Midwest people, there was nobody else from different theories. You had 3 professors who agreed it was basically all social media's fault, and you called it a job well done. And as I've been studying this space, one of the things I noticed was there was a guy called Fiorina and another guy called Abramowitz. Mm-hmm. And they directly opposed each other. And both were very smart and very well researched. And one was saying, Fiorina was saying, polarization is not really a problem. The people are basically still kind of agree with each other. They don't really get too hyped up on this. And Abramowitz was saying, you're wrong. You're wrong. And then also the debate on what causes it. I've seen many professors say social media. Get rid of social media and cable news or MSNBC and Fox, and everything snaps back to place. But then you'll interview professors who were doing the study in 2005 and 2010 before social media and Fox and MSNBC, and they're already talking about polarization. So there seems to be a big debate on, is it a problem? And what is the cause? It sounds like that's what you saw at this conference. Could you talk more about how we don't have agreed upon conclusions in this intellectual space?
Yeah. So, I mean, you pointed to quite a number of things there, including some strong disagreements. I'd say that the space where people are talking about political polarization is one that does allow for some disagreement. Like, not everybody is being pushed to have one perspective on it. But as with your NPR example, if you want a wide diversity of political perspectives, don't go to professors to get them, right? Like
this series is the exception to that, but I see what you're saying. Absolutely agree.
Because professors have generally for quite a long time leaned liberal, but that has gotten much, much more extreme in recent years. And although I identify myself in that camp, I also consider it a problem. I think that we're actually missing a pretty large part of the story on a lot of things, and that might actually even be contributing to some of the polarization, because the narratives coming out of academia often get picked up in the media, and a lot of them have been extremely, I think, sort of pathologizing even of conservatives, right? So often when we see a problem, we're like, oh, what's the answer to this problem? Let me try to understand the thing I don't understand and find all of the fault within that thing. And so for a lot of liberal academics, it has been like pointing the focus directly on the conservative side.
Wow. I've been coming to that conclusion too.
Yeah.
There's a Professor Lee Jessup we interviewed here in America. He said the same thing. Corey Clark's another person we have scheduled to interview. She said the same thing. And then there were other people who would kind of begrudgingly admit it. They would go, well, yeah, maybe it's not a problem, but 97% of all the professors in the social psychology, political science space are all avowed liberals, basically. So, but then they would go, well, I don't know that's a problem. I mean, we're all trained to check our biases and then we could just follow the information. In fact, I was talking with one professor and she goes, yeah, but that's not a problem because we're trained to check our biases and we only go where the data shows. And I go, okay, I have read a lot about this and I have 3 different instances of professors who are well credited in this space going, here's my research, here's what I found. And then basically at the end of their presentation, they kind of turn to the camera and go, but come on, guys, we know who the real bad guy is. I mean, look at one party's trying to repress women and repress minorities and loves racism and loves it. And I'm like, you just blew apart your scientific indifference. I mean, it was a 30-minute presentation. You stuck to the data. And then at the end, you kind of did an aside and going, come on, we know who's up. Then I read another book. I'm not trying to name names, but the guy wrote a whole book going, oh, here's the problems with the left and here's the problems with the right. I'm trying to cover both fairly. But then as an introduction, he goes, some people say both sides need to improve. Wrong. This is really just all one side's fault. And they're all bad and it's all them. And we really don't need to look at the other side. And I go, that is extreme bias from 2 of the top names in this field. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to cause any drama, but I'm really just out for understanding, but I'm like, if I was a conservative and I saw that, I would never believe anything you had to say or anything any of your colleagues would have to say. And I would go, see, this is another liberal cult out to get us. And then I would hold up these 2 examples and go, Exhibit A in their quotes, Exhibit B in their quotes. These things are already published. Just nobody's paying attention to it. And I go, that's not good. And I've asked a few other professors, is it reasonable to say when you're looking at a society and you're trying to fix political polarization to go, this side doesn't need to do anything. It's really all you guys and your side, and you're all wrong and you're bad and you have to make all the changes. And we really don't need to make any changes. I'm like, does that sound intellectually honest and adult and like anything that's going to work at a mass scale? And a couple of professors said, no, that is never going to get off the ground. And I go, well, then we got a real problem. Houston, to borrow an American phrase, we seem to have some bias in academia. We seem to have some academics who basically don't hide their bias anymore and are still well thought of in the field. And we seem to have no recognition from liberals in the field that this is actually happening. Is that good for us eventually coming to a conclusion as a society and accepting that conclusion and moving on it?
No.
Wow.
And I say this as as a liberal in-group member, that this is a real issue, that not only is it meaning that we're less likely to get a full understanding of what these issues are, but we're also really going to just undermine, I think, some of the institutional trust that we ought to be really taking seriously when it comes to, do people believe scientists and social scientists and believe that, when we tell you the evidence that we're gathering, that this is trustworthy, that this is, taking the full kind of picture into account. The more we, I think, self-justify on those kinds of grounds, the worse off we're going to be. So one of the things that I've been studying in my lab is the role of in-group dissent. One thing that you often see is that, both sides get plenty of criticism, right? They get lots of criticism from the other side, but you often will find, especially in a really polarized environment, that people from within a party or from within a political side will really hesitate to criticize themselves, right? And this happens especially in heightened threat situations. So if you feel like you're threatened by the outgroup, then you circle the wagons and you don't want to criticize the in-group. But in fact, criticizing the in-group is actually one of the most loyal things that you can do in some cases, right? Because it's really important to hear disagreements from within one's group and to see that there are different perspectives, or that maybe we're going a little off the rails on this, or that we're not considering important perspectives on that, right? So I think that that's something that I've been trying to add to the conversation, and as a potential way of addressing some of the polarization that we're seeing. I'm not sure if I answered all of your questions.
No, you did. There's a lot. There's Liliana Mason. Others have famously made this argument that the reason we're seeing so much effective polarization of I hate the other side is that people have really identified with their group. And so I'm so identified with my group. So you must be the other group. And therefore, because you're not my group, I can assume the worst possible things about you, and I can overestimate how bad you are and how wicked and evil you are. We're almost to a point that's not really realistic. Like if you're only 30% sinful or liar behavior, I'll assume it's 70%. It's really only 30%, but I'll just assume. And we seem to be hardwired as a species to kind of very quickly with little prompts fall into these tribal groups. Now, the other thing is that we can break tribes and reform tribes. Canadian identity, American identity, many different people of different religions and races and creeds, English can come together and go, I feel I'm Canadian. I feel I'm an American. Maybe my mom came from Saudi Arabia. My dad was from Ireland, but I grew up, I'm going to use the American example, eating steaks and burgers and watching football. The Canadian example could be, watching hockey from age 2 and maple, all the good stuff you have up there. And, you grew up in that Canadian society. Maybe it doesn't matter your mom was from Syria because you started there at age 2. So all you really know is a lot of Canadian hockey and whoever the Canadian stars are. By age 25, you kind of identify yourself as a Canadian, but it's still a tribal understanding. It was built in. And when we make these things, like you said, tribal, and there's a threat, then it seems to be, I'm with this group, you must be the other group. And I noticed a lot of that with American politics. And what scared me was, I remember being a teenage boy, and I'm Latino, so I watched some movies as a teenage boy about Latin gangs in prison. And the behavior I see in American politics now reminds me a lot of the Latin gang in prison movies I watched in the 80s and 90s. You don't dare talk bad about our gang. I don't care if a member of our gang did do something wrong. You never say anything. And, did a member of our gang say that the gang was wrong about an issue? I guess Carlos has to disappear now. Has to be and I'm like, that's what we do now. There's a narrative on this side. You step out of that narrative, you're gone. Just immediately. There's no understanding or let's reform. You're removed, gone. And you better never, ever say anything bad about our side, even if it's totally true. Just don't bring it up. We don't need to talk about it. I'm like, that's like prison gangs.
And it can really lead to a lot of stagnation, right? Of just bad ideas are left to fester. It means that we don't self-correct when we're going off track on something. And, it's often not going to be the case that we're going to get those corrections from the other side, right? The other side's offering lots of criticisms. But if we're not willing to take a look at ourselves and take seriously the fact that we aren't ever going to be in a situation where we're just getting it all right, then that's a real problem. And I think, that's something, of course, that can happen in lots of other situations too. It's not just about political polarization, but it happens especially in these contexts where polarization is so extreme that people feel really that it's important to protect the in-group at all costs. One of my favorite studies, I'm pretty sure Druckmann is the first author, it's an older study, but it's looking at the degree to which people are paying attention to the strengths of arguments. Okay. So say somebody's proposing a policy and they have, 5 really good reasons for this policy, or 5 kind of crappy reasons, like really weak reasons for some kind of a policy. So a smart reasoner is going to be able to pay attention to the arguments and say, okay, well, these are pretty good reasons. These are not such good reasons. I'm convinced by this. I'm not convinced by that. And so they were presenting people with different kinds of policies. And under a context where they told people that there were these 2 political sides and they're really, really polarized, people stopped paying attention to the strength of the argument. So normally people like the policy that's strong, don't like the policy that's weak. And then they say, oh, well, actually, but this was proposed by this party and it's in this polarized context. People just simply started going in lockstep. So they liked the policy if it was their sides, and they didn't like the policy if it was the other sides. So, this is really just weakening our capacity to get things done in an effective way, right? Because we're not paying attention to the data as much as we ought to be.
I was interviewing another professor out of Michigan yesterday, and she was saying something very similar. They looked at newspaper headlines, and they had 2 groups they were experimenting with, and they'd feed them headlines normally, and people would be like, oh, I'm mad, or I'm not mad, depending if they were liberal or conservative. And then they stripped the title of the newspapers off. Mm-hmm. So all you got was a paragraph. And they found polarization. It wasn't eliminated, but it dropped by 50% that fast.
Yeah.
Because there was no markers. Like, I don't know if this is right or left. I don't know what publication at all. It's just something happened today and this person did that. Okay. And they would try to polarize, but there wasn't the cues they needed to do that so easily. 50% reduction immediately. And I was like, wow, there's no identifiers there. People can't immediately go, oh, this is part of this camp. So when they're left to figure it out on their own, humans don't seem to be as good at polarizing themselves without cues being given to them.
Yeah. And it depends on what the groups are, right? That right. We're polarizing around. So right now we're polarizing on politics. In the past, it would have been polarizing on other kinds of things, right? So it used to be, for example, that large numbers of people would say that they'd be upset if their kid was thinking about marrying someone of a different race.
Right.
And now the numbers are very, very low for that, right? You get almost nobody who says that. Yet you get increasingly high numbers of people who say, like, I would be absolutely devastated if my kid wanted to marry someone of the other political party. So, we always tend to have those polarization moments, but right now it's around politics.
I was talking with a colleague and we were going, well, I guess it's progress. Because I remember when it was, don't bring home an African-American person or a Mexican, oh my God, or an Asian. And now some of the most racist people that I used to know don't seem to care about that. But if you're talking like a liberal, oh my God, and I'm like, I guess that's progress. We're not as racist anymore, but we seem to have, but in America, we went from, and I'm not sure if maybe it's not the same in Canada, but there's one study that was showing in 2012, only 30% of the population would not date someone of the other political party.
Yeah.
Now it's like closer to 60%. So it's closer to clearly over half the population won't have anything to do, won't marry, won't date, won't befriend, nothing with the other side. And, that leads, I think, to things like January 6th. So racism is bad and racism is wrong. And we always wanted integration, but wow, you get one problem, you take another. I mean, I never thought this was how we were going to get over racism, was hating each other so much over politics, so that we just replay. I'm like, is that really a good solution? Is that what Martin Luther King was thinking when he gave his speech? Like, here's how we get rid of racism. We find another way to really, really, really hate each other even more. I'm like, I just don't see the people in the 1960s marching for civil rights thinking, The solution is to find another way to hate each other more, to replace, especially when they're talking about love and whatever. Let's come back to this one. I'm sorry for the distraction. I really want to hear this though, because I've thought it. So there is, for the public to know, there is an academic debate on if polarization is even real. That is still going on with academia. So a lot of people have said to me, how did it get so bad? And I go, well, part of it is we don't have an agreement on if it's a problem. You'll have some professor saying it's like Liliana Wilson is saying, Mason is saying it's a problem. But then you'll have Fiorina and everybody who quotes him going, yeah, I don't know if it's that big a problem. Maybe we don't really need to worry about it. And I'm like, we can't handle a problem if we don't even agree it's a problem, right? We're never going to mobilize to deal with that. And people have been saying that since 2010. It's not that bad. Just got done reading a couple books about 2010. They're 2010, 2015. They're like, yeah, it's bad, but it's not that bad. And I'm like, you people had, and they're writing this at the time. They never thought a guy like Trump would run for office. They never thought he would get elected. They never thought he would do all the stuff he did in his presidency. And no one ever in their wildest imagined anything like January 4th. Nobody. Yeah. And yet we can read these books from scholars in 2005 to 2015 going, boy, this is as bad as it's ever going to get. Polarization's so bad, but maybe it's, workable. America's had tough times before. Come on, guys. And I keep thinking, if we had raised the alarm bell to a fever pitch in 2010, maybe January 6th never would have happened. Maybe it was us continually telling ourselves, it's not that bad. We'll get over it. It's not that bad. We've had worse times. We'll get over it. Because January 6th caught people off guard here. They're like, what's going on? People are storming the Capitol. It was a wake-up bell. It was like, yeah, it's that bad, folks. Maybe you didn't want to know that. You didn't want to hear that. You wanted to think, oh, Americans are mad. They'll cool off. January 6th, one of the things I liked about it was a horrible bit. It shouldn't have happened. People stopped debating if polarization was a problem only on January 3rd or January 7th. That was the first time Americans stopped debating on, is this really an issue? Is it go, no, this is a problem. That was at least one thing. And I'm going, wow, what if we had come to that conclusion a decade before and motivated people? And here's the other issue. Professor, tell me if I'm wrong, but there is not agreement in academia on what the cause of polarization is there?
No, there's not. And at least part of the reason that there isn't, I think, is because it's such a complex problem that it's going to be multi-causal. So
sure,
the idea that we can point to one single cause and then that's all of what's going on, I think is probably just unrealistic, because it's probably not how polarization happens. And a lot of times these sorts of processes tend to feed on one another, right? So part of it, and I'm sure you've heard about all of these kinds of proposed causes, part of it has to do with, the way that politics has changed over time. The fact that sometimes our political elites are actually more extreme even than regular citizens, regular voters. So you've got some of politics having to do with that kind of sorting in the actual political actor sphere. Some of it has had to do with the rise of more partisan media and what has sometimes been called the outrage industry. Barry and Soburai wrote a book about that a few years ago, and how, the whole business model of media has changed in so many ways that relies on people's eyeballs, right, or clicks and that sort of thing. And one of the most reliable ways to get people's attention is to make sure that they stay mad and scared. And so that's another part of it. As you mentioned earlier, a lot of people are pointing to social media as a part of it. Now, I certainly don't think that it's the cause of anything, because polarization was already on the rise prior to social media. But I think that it can exacerbate things, right? So it's basically, you've already got some kind of a fire on, in progress, and then you just add some additional gas. And I do think that social media can, because of the way that it's designed, it can make things worse. So I think one of the things that is concerning right now is that we've got a history of many decades of factors that have all played into this, right? That then change people's relationship patterns. Who are you friends with? Where do you live? Who are you willing to date or marry? And those things are all going to end up making it worse. And then the media domain also is set up in such a way that it seems like it's adding fuel to the fire, at the very least, even if it's not the cause. So I guess I'm not really answering your question about what the cause is, but I think that those are a number of components, right? So
you're confirming there is debate, and these were just conclusions until I was able to speak to somebody who's an academic like you, who's gone to conference with a lot of very impressive names and confirm. Part of the reason polarization today is so bad is we don't even agree if it's real, and we don't even agree on what the cause is. So I can only imagine if we're actually doing problem solving and we had agreed 10 years ago on what the problem was and that it's real, we might have been able to do something about it. I finished reading a book by Jared Diamond, a famous sociologist. He wrote a book called Collapse. It's world famous. It's about a book of collapsed societies. One of the top reasons societies collapse, they fail to appreciate the severity of the problem they're facing at the time.
Yeah.
And they fail to adequately move enough resources to deal with it. So, there's these barbarians at the gates. They'll get over it. They'll calm down. No, they'll overthrow the entire Roman Republic. Oh, we're having kind of a water problem. Let's build more wells. That's what destroyed the Maya civilization. And he's pointing out example after example where they did not appreciate the problems that were right in their face, and they did not agree on it, and they did not mobilize resources fast enough. And if they had, they could have survived hundreds more years. So I look at that and I look at this and going, we got all these people talking and we can't agree if it's a problem. We can't even agree on the solution. I'm like, that's what led to the collapse of other civilizations. Now, maybe that's not going to happen here, but I don't like that it's lining up even this much. I find it problematic.
I'll push back on you a little bit on one thing, though. So the idea that we should all agree on it being a problem, right, or anything like that. And I think that one of the things that I will always want to see in academia and anywhere else is disagreement. So that's the idea. Like, I think that there are often bad things that happen when we all end up on the exact same page, right? Because then we stop debating where the fine points are and that sort of thing. So I'm not so concerned about the fact that there are disagreements about whether or not it's a problem or exactly where it's come from or anything like that. I do think, though, that there's been a lot of debate and not so much action, or not so much figuring out, like, what can we do about it, right? And at least one of the reasons for that, there's quite a strain, I'd say, and this is coming from maybe both sides, but I'd certainly say from a lot of liberals, including some scholars, saying that, we don't actually want to address it. Like, why would we want to fix polarization? There's no good to be seen in the other side. There's nothing positive about compromise if compromise means compromising with awful, terrible people with racist views, or those kinds of things. So there has been, I think, some strains of thinking where it's like, well, it's actually fine that we're so polarized because we're right and the other side is entirely wrong. And so we're just gonna assume that they're all write-offs. And I think that might also reduce some of the motivation to try to actually fix it.
I didn't know that. I do agree with the good pushback. You're right. There should always be disagreement in academia. I don't know what the right answer is. It still seems like it's the 1950s and they're debating if cigarettes are bad for lung cancer. And I'm like, people, we have to get past this. We have to come to some sort of, there could be the 5% of professors who say, no, cigarettes are great for lung cancer. Okay, fine. But can we get some sort of consensus moving forward so we don't have another million people die of lung cancer and another million and another million? And I remember when the Surgeon General came out saying cigarettes cause lung cancer. It was a debate for a while longer afterwards. I mean, it shocked some people, but there were other people who go, no, he's wrong. So, and then lots of people died from lung cancer who didn't have to. So that's where but this is scary. Why do we need to fix polarization? We're right. The other side is wrong. I've seen that kind of behavior. And that's why I've asked some professors, like, can we fix a problem that involves two parties by saying one party's all bad and wrong and does everything wrong, and the other party's perfect and good and does nothing wrong. And so only one side needs to change. I mean, does that work in societies with two people? Does that work in relationships of two humans? Or do both sides have to give and take a little bit in order to have a compromise moving forward?
Yeah, not only does it not work, I mean, it pretty much never works to have that kind of perspective, but it's also just factually incorrect, right? There's never been a case where one side has all of the right answers and the other side has all of the wrong answers. And that one side wakes up and says, what good can I do in the world today? And the other side wakes up and says, what evil can I do in the world today? And so those are caricatures. And I think that we're at a stage where a fair number of people on both sides have caricatures of their opponents that look a lot like that, and those are just wrong. So
it scares me because some of the people who are being held up as the greatest minds studying political polarization from a completely unbiased manner are making statements like that. Not everybody. Mm-hmm. I've only noticed a few, but I'm going, is that a good thing? To have that level of bias out there while you're having this study? I remember in law and when I was in college, they said you're supposed to hide your bias. I mean, yeah, you have it, but you're not supposed to project it out there. You're supposed to try to tamp it down, not go, I'm biased, look at me. Here's my academic study, buy it. And I'm like, I'm not a professor, but that seems totally opposite from what they were teaching in college. One of the issues for me is I'm in California. I get it. We're super liberal compared to the rest of America, although I'm in the somewhat half conservative part in Fresno. But in California, the story goes, everything was perfect. And then Donald Trump came and he made America broke by himself and he brought racism. Or if you don't want to buy that, it was Trump and social media. And until Twitter and Facebook came along and Fox and MSNBC, everything was perfect and there were no problems. And you have academics, elected officials, TV commentators, well-respected people in the news for decades all saying this. Now, not everybody's saying it. And that flies in the face of people who were talking about polarization in 1990, 2000, 2005, 2008 with the Tea Party. There's a lot of professors going, wow, look at the way the Tea Party's interacting with Obama and doing the birther conspiracy and trying to say, we don't want to pass any laws. We just want to make sure he can't pass any laws. And that was a new form of governance. When you had political parties in the past, they usually, you got into office and you had to pass some laws for your constituents. The Tea Party comes in and their whole thing is just shut it all down, get nothing done, shut it all down. And they're rewarded for that while engaging in a quasi gaslighting, dog whistling, racist birther conspiracy. All that is before Trump. All that's before really Twitter, Facebook were super big. I mean, they were around. And I'm going, how is that responsible for things that came afterwards? And then we go back to Bill Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and they had the entire country up in arms over that. That was over, the Monica Lewinsky scandal was able to be so polarizing in America because of a blog site called The Drudge Report. There was no social media at the time. There were 3 major networks and CNN. All of them were skipping out on the Monica Lewinsky site issue. They were going to let it go. Drudge by himself on his blog on the internet pushed it and forced it to become a national issue all the networks had to cover. When I look at that, I go, well, that doesn't sound like social media. That sounds like just the internet itself is a problem. Guess we should just get rid of the internet. So how come we have professors saying it's all Trump and it's all social media when there were problems before? Why are there still professors running out there saying that?
Well, I think professors, just like anyone else, are sometimes, we all have our little piece of the world that we pay attention to. And so where you go looking for causes, you can often find part of the cause, right? And so a lot of professors, and me included to some extent, started paying more attention to these issues around the time of Trump.
Right.
For me, when Trump was elected, I was actually shocked. I was one of those people, sitting up, even though it's not even my country. a lot of what happens in the States matters for Canada, right? So we're certainly not at all immune to the kinds of problems that come from the polarization that's happening, especially in the States. But I was upset and shocked, but I also took a couple of steps back and maybe did something a little different than some of my colleagues, which was to say, what am I getting wrong? What am I missing? And what is academia missing in trying to understand what's going on? So it was a bit of a launching point for a lot of people, though, to say, okay, well, let's try to understand this problem. And for some people, they were just so upset and so mad about what happened with the Trump election that was the starting point of what they were looking for. Like, let's see how we can blame Trump voters and demonize Trump voters and find the cause of the problem within this group. And that's not to excuse Trump voters,
or to excuse
some of the negatives of the vitriol and incivility and racism at times, and a lot of what he brought to the table, right?
Absolutely.
But I think there's a lot of stuff that was happening prior to that, and at least part of what I was interested in was well, what led us to a point where somebody like Trump could get elected? And so it doesn't just happen out of the blue. That's something that was likely. It might be the cause of some polarization, but it's likely also the effect of this rising polarization, the degree to which people on the right were feeling really disrespected by and sneered at by people on the left, may not have really felt like they were even being represented by folks in their own party all that much. And so, Trump has sometimes been described as just sort of like a screw you to the whole system. That I don't like any of this, right?
Yeah.
I think that at that time, in sort of ratings of attitudes, Congress was rated, I might get this a little bit wrong, but Congress was rated about just slightly above cockroaches or something like that in terms of how much people liked. So there was just a general sense that things were not working. And it's not shocking when you're at that point that somebody who comes in and says, I'm going to blow up the system, might get a lot of votes.
He was unpopular, except for a key group of people. A statistic a lot of people don't like bringing up this day is that during the campaign trail, there was one point in the campaign where he and Hillary were both equally as unpopular to American voters. We don't like to bring that up now. It's easy to go, oh, he was the bad guy. But there was a point on the campaign trail before he was president where the surveys were coming in and it was like, a majority of Americans don't like either one of you, just to be clear. Basically, almost disgusted with both of you equally. We don't say that now, but whatever. I want to ask you about this. Looking from outside of America, because one of the things that got me, and this is, can America fix this problem? Before you answer, I want to present a story. There's this place called Europe, and they are very interested in what happens in America. They feel it affects them too. Their security posture, their economics, their future, etc. So when America elected Donald Trump, many Europeans were saying, "Oh my God, are you not a democracy anymore? Is that what's going on?" And the American officials said, "No, this is just a fluke. It's a fluke. It'll go away, and we'll repudiate him." And then Joe Biden ran as president, and he said, "I'm running for the soul of America, and we have seen Trump for 4 years, and we have to repudiate him. Let him know. Let the world know we don't like this. We hate his xenophobia and racism." And then Joe Biden won the election by 2% over 50%. And in America, they were saying, boy, he trashed Trump. So many more millions of voters voted for Biden. So many more millions of voters came out to vote for Biden. In Europe, they had a completely different headline in all of their newspapers. And it went something like this: 2% is not a repudiation. What the hell's going on, America? You said you guys were going to reject him. We're talking about 65, 70%. You barely got over half the country to reject this guy after 4 years? You guys are crazy. We should have no trust and faith in you. And then about a year later, you started to see France and England start to talk with Canada and Japan about a new North Atlantic Treaty Group because they weren't sure about NAFTA or NATO with America. Now, this is before the Ukraine war, which shored up NATO, but there was a period where people were saying, maybe we need to remake World War II alliances because we can't trust these Americans. We said we did a good job. Europe said, hell no, you didn't. And Europe said this was a coup. Some Americans want to debate that. And then we had January 6th. And all of the Americans missed it. And the Europeans were saying, that's what we were talking about. We told you you didn't repudiate this guy. And in America, when I tell the story, almost no Americans are aware of that. They're not aware of the European feel. They're not aware of the Europeans were shocked. They thought, oh, yeah, we repudiated him. No, you didn't. So can America get over Trumpism when we as Americans feel we repudiated him, but all of our allies feel we didn't even come close?
That's a good question. It's not something I can answer with a lot of expertise. So I'm not aware of like how those polls went in Europe. I'd say from a Canadian perspective.
Does that make you feel good as a Canadian? America barely votes out Trump.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't, but maybe not for exactly the reasons that you're suggesting. So, partly I think a lot of people see the US political system as just broken might be too extreme a word, but
no, it's not.
The system is such that you're almost always, so close to 50-50. And as far as, and you're flipping back and forth and that sort of thing. And it seems like for a lot of people, it doesn't even matter who the candidate is. It's just going to be, I'm a Republican, I'm going to vote Republican, or I'm a Democrat, I'm going to vote Democrat. And so you've got such small amounts of swing in there that it's not all that shocking when things end up being pretty close to 50-50, right? So it was a sigh of relief that Trump was out for a number of reasons, including anyway, I don't need to.
Of course, and I agree.
But it wasn't. I didn't see it necessarily as a huge shock that it wasn't a massive repudiation in the sense of 70%. The idea of 20 or 30% of Republicans actually voting Democrat suddenly or something, that just seems almost unbelievable in the US context currently. Right. And I think that does tie back to polarization, because even if you are in a situation where you're saying, hey, I have some real misgivings about what my side is up to. I have misgivings about this leader, the way that he's behaving both in our country and on a world stage. I have misgivings about some of the events like January 6th and all of those kinds of things. Even if you are feeling that way, if you're actually convinced that the other side is just a bunch of demons, right? Like that the other side is even worse, then you're going to be willing to accept an awful lot of bad behavior on your side because, you just don't have an alternative. And I think that that's a real worry.
I don't like what my side's doing, but at least we're not demons and Satan incarnate. And, if Satan gets in charge, it's going to be real bad. Yep. So better make sure that doesn't happen. And whatever we got to do, maybe bend the rules a little bit. It's okay, because you don't want Satan in charge. I mean, this is an existential end of the world threat if the other side wins the election. Got to pull out all the stops.
Yeah, that idea right there. So the idea that the other side is an existential threat or a threat to our democracy itself is something that can lead to such a worrying slippery slope, because once you start to believe that about the other side, it can start to feel like, oh, well, maybe we should cut some corners here. Maybe we could cheat a little bit because, ultimately it's going to be better for our side to win, even if we don't necessarily take the most ethical route to get there. So, there's a lot of moral justification that can happen when you feel like you're fighting evil. And that's, I think, the idea that there's some threat to democracy itself is a realistic one there, I think.
Yeah, it's just scary. I was scared more, not by January 6th, but when the Republican Party walked back their condemnation of it. I never in a million years ever thought in my wildest dreams I would ever see anything like that. I could see people losing their cool, rioting. We've had riots. But for one group to go, yeah, we condemn that. Oh, but did we condemn a treason and coup? Let's walk that back. I'm like, wow, never saw that. On the other hand, just to be fair, Joseph Biden gave a speech. It was at nighttime. He had a red light backdrop behind him with 2 active duty Marines. That's not typical for American speeches at all. They're not at night with dramatic night and red and Marines ready around them. And then he basically seemed to say 79 million Americans were basically enemies of the state. And when I talk to fellow liberals about that, I go, do you see how we're already dealing with such levels of polarization? And then the leader of the country says basically 79 million of you are just bad guys like ISIS. How that could just make it worse. Most liberals I talked to said he wasn't hardcore enough. And I'm like, okay, that does not seem like we're going to get anywhere good soon. Last questions. How do we fix this, Professor? How can America, we've talked about the levels of depth of problem. Was there solutions that everyone agreed or most people agreed or seemed to be boiling to the top of how Americans can get themselves out of this situation?
Well, good question. I think that solutions have been talked about in lots of different spheres, right? So I'll speak mostly about stuff coming out of psychology and academia and some of the interdisciplinary approaches there, right? But I'd say that, anything that we're addressing in a scholarly way is often pretty small potatoes, right? It's pretty small scale kind of stuff. So the biggest challenge for me is like, how do you take these ideas and then scale them up to something that would actually work at a more collective level? So I think that there are some things that have been shown to be effective. One is because I talked before about how, we have these caricatures of the other side, and these caricatures tend to really emphasize the most extreme, the most egregious, the most negative aspects of the other side. And you might actually be able to find a handful of people who do really fit those stereotypes, right? There are actual deplorables, there are actual, right? But they're just not very common. There aren't very many of them.
Yeah, the size of them is exaggerated.
Yeah. So one of the things that you can do is try to push back against those misconceptions. And so this is the notion of like at least trying to dial back on the false polarization that's happening. In some of my own research, we find that a lot of the hate and animosity comes from the false conceptions of the other side more than the true differences between us and the other side, right? So people actually don't get as mad at the other side when they find out about policy differences, like I'm for this, you're against this, tax differences, even things like, say, reproductive rights and stuff like that. They tend to inspire less extreme vitriol than some of the things that we're imagining are different. So that's one place you can potentially get some traction, is to try to correct for that. Another is to encourage people to just get to know people on the other side and to actually have conversations and that sort of thing. That is much easier said than done. So we know in psychology that the contact hypothesis, the contact theory is the idea that, like, one of the best ways to reduce prejudice and stereotyping and increase liking across parties is to get people to engage with one another in ways that are not too competitive, that allow you to actually see the humanity in other people. You can actually think about ways to form friendships and that sort of thing. And so that's another thing that that you can do. But again, that's tricky to actually make happen in large numbers. And then I think the other thing that that may help is to help people to understand the ways that some of the levers that are being pulled by political elites, by media, by social media, and so on, are not things that are working for their own best interests. And so what I mean by that is, like, we could try to correct every misconception, or try to get people to like others on the other side a little bit better by forming friendships or getting to know a few people and that sort of thing. But if the polarization that we're seeing right now actually benefits people in power, right? If it benefits politicians, if it benefits media and social media companies, makes them more money and so on, if it's benefiting the folks in power but not benefiting people on the ground because they're seeing this ineffectual political system that's not getting things done, that's causing more and more problems, right? So if that's happening, then people may be able to just get a little bit inoculated from some of the BS that they are exposed to in these spaces and say, like, you know what? I think that you're trying to whip up my hatred of the other side because it's good for you, but not because it's good for me, right? And if enough people started to just get exasperated by those messages, it could be that would lead them to start choosing different political leaders, or tuning into different kinds of media, or curating their social media in different ways, and so on, and become a little bit less easily persuaded by the stories that tend to really just ramp up the kind of hostility that we're seeing.
So if we could, two things, contact hypothesis theory, and then if we could also, I guess, be better educated consumers of politics. So notice that there is and I've heard this, there's a profit cycle. So a politician says something extreme that gets them attention on social media, that gets the news paying attention. The news shows a politician saying something extreme that gets them attention, so they get advertising revenue. The politician now gets donations, so everybody makes money promoting something extreme, and the only way out would be consumers to say, I'm not buying that anymore, and the fact that you were so extreme kind of turns me off now, so I won't increase your donations to you when you say something extreme. It introduced new markets. TV channels would say, wow, we lost viewers because we aired something so extreme. So a better educated consumer base. And that's possible. I remember when in the 1980s, they had really violent movies. And in the 1990s, they said, we need to make movies less violent. And we still have violent movies, but they're a lot less per capita than they were in the 80s. And the way they did that was by educating the public to go, maybe you don't need to go see super gory, violent movies, like every single movie's like that. So it could be done. And then there's the contact theory. I want to ask you about the contact theory. I've heard you got to be careful with this. It's not a silver bullet, because if you say, hey, I'm going to go meet a conservative and I'm a liberal, and you walk up to a conservative and go, so you believe in racism and white supremacy, and you kind of voted for a guy who supports treason, you didn't actually make anything better, right? Like you made it worse now. So just going and contacting somebody, I've heard from professors, it has to be done the right way. Having a wave of people just go out there and start meeting the other could go really badly if it's not done correctly. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's for sure the case.
Okay.
There are a couple of ways that you can imagine contact happening. One is by just getting to know people in your community, right? And so a lot of times the way that's happened historically is that, you know somebody from church, or somebody from a community group or whatever else. And politics is not the first thing that you talk about, but eventually you might find that you disagree on some things. but you've already come to see that the person is a decent person and has basically the same sorts of values that you do. They want to have a decent life for their family and stuff like that, right? So contact can really work in cases where you don't start off with that kind of major chance for conflict.
Right.
One thing that makes that harder now is that we're less likely to actually encounter people who have different political views from us in our daily lives. So we tend to live in enclaves of people who are more like us, not always, but often.
Thank you.
So it can be tricky to actually get those kinds of things to happen. And we know that like people are less likely to be just engaging in community groups, right? So as we've had a decline of churches and community kinds of organizations and that sort of thing, I think that Bowling Alone is a famous book talking about that kind of stuff, right? So there's just a lot of ways in which the normal cross group interactions that have happened have declined. So one of the things that we do instead is interact with people in social media spaces. So you may have come across Chris Bale is somebody who's done some research looking at this. And so they had the big idea that, hey, maybe we can do something like a contact hypothesis by getting people to follow people on the other side on social media, right, on Twitter, and that sort of thing. And so you're going to get exposed to all of these ideas and all of these people on the other side that are going to be different. And hey, this is going to be good. It's going to make people more likely to see across the aisle and so on. And they did that in a big Twitter study. They paid people to follow people on the other side and so on. And it turned out after going through this really big process that it actually had the opposite effect. So it made things worse. People actually came to dislike each other even more. And so this is a good example of how contact theory can go wrong. And then he wrote a whole book about this afterwards and talked about how at least part of the reason for that is that when you're exposed to people in these online spaces, you're often going to be exposed to the most extreme, the most vitriolic, the most nasty versions of people on the other side. And that's not the kind of way to have contact theory work, right? Because if you're just being exposed to people who are awful from the outset, then you're just going to end up confirming your original perspective rather than finding ways that you might actually see common ground. So, there's a bunch of stuff that needs to happen for contact theory to work well, I think.
So contact theory can make polarization worse in some cases, as exemplified by Professor Chris Bale. Yeah, I'd heard that. And I like the fact that you brought up, everybody's so sorted. So what sort of contact are we doing? One of the questions I've asked people is a liberal Republican in downtown San Francisco, the most conservative liberal city in all of America, exactly like a conservative Republican in rural Kentucky? So if you go to San Francisco and you say, I'm going to have a conversation, I'm a liberal, and I'm going to have a conversation with a Republican and build bridges. And I went down to my local Starbucks right here in Market Street in downtown San Francisco. And this Republican told me, well, I'm only Republican because I like taxes and I like taxes reformed and regulation. And I don't believe women shouldn't have the right to choose. I don't believe in being prejudicial against LGBTQ. And I said, are you going to find the same conversation if you picked up the phone and you had it with a Republican in the rural panhandle of Texas or the rural region of Kentucky? And the reason I say that is I have family in San Francisco and Santa Monica. And then the other half, my Mexican side, is from Dumas, which is near Amarillo. Amarillas, it's pronounced, in the panhandle of Texas. They're nothing alike. Yeah. The Republicans here on the coast are not like the Republicans in rural, isolated Texas. And they do care about a lot of those social issues more. So I was saying, is it okay if I go down to my local Starbucks in my super liberal community and have a conversation with a Republican who's basically liberal on everything except for 2 points and say, job's done, I have healed America? Or do I really need to go to talk to the person in the super conservative community to actually have divides bridged?
I think that it's not pointless to have the conversation with the Republican in San Francisco or whatever, right? I think that there is some ways in which we're going to have, there's a limit to how many differences you can have before it just gets unproductive, right? So having those discussions, even if you have some things in common, but you have other things that are quite different, I think that that's a good starting place. But you're right, that to really come to understand all of the different perspectives, you're not going to get that by walking down the street and meeting somebody who's actually like pretty liberal for a typical Republican or something like that. I'm not sure, though, that that's a new thing. I think that, like, it's a big country. There's always been those kinds of differences. And when you think about America as a very kind of pluralistic place, that's actually a good thing. There are tons of different cultures and tons of different kind of perspectives within one nation. And so it might be that you have to take baby steps to get there, right? So you start off by talking to someone that you share some things with, and then it takes a while before you're actually going to hop down and get into the deep South and talk to someone who's really opposed to you on almost everything that you stand for.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here and answering the questions. We're down to our last two questions. So first one, you're not you, you're not me, you're a third person watching this video. They're watching it a week from now. They've watched this video and boy, have they learned a lot. They're like, wow, I didn't know there was so much debate. I didn't know there was these academic discussions within the field. But they're struggling to remember everything that was said. However, they keep telling themselves, there's this one thing the professor said, and I just can't get it out of my head. And it's 5 days later after watching the video. What is the one thing you want a random person you'll never meet to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days after watching this video when they struggle to remember what the rest of the video was about?
Well, I don't know if I emphasized it well enough for somebody to remember it 5 days from now, but the thing I'd like them to take away from it would be that even if you think that the other side is awful in a lot of ways, the degree to which we have common ground is actually, a lot more meaningful than we sometimes recognize. And if you need to have sort of if you need there to be a villain, let's say, it might be better to point to, the folks in power who are pulling these levers and say, like, look, some of this polarization is benefiting someone, but it ain't us. So that's probably the thing that I'd want you to take away. So, have a big grain of salt when you're hearing a story that's getting you really whipped up and really angry, because those are the sorts of things that that tend to benefit folks in power. But it isn't necessarily going to be good for us in any way, and certainly not good for the future of the political unit.
That's good. That's really good. I hope you found this was a fair interview. We didn't, you got to say your piece. We didn't edit or alter it. You don't have to answer, but we always ask. We like to keep the conversation going. Do you have any recommendations? Do you know anybody who might be willing to be part of an honest conversation? Again, you don't have to, but we always ask. We like to keep the conversation going.
Oh, yeah, I got a couple. I don't know who would say yes, but I mentioned, I think at the beginning, Amy Gordon is somebody that started to do some, and she's been working with Eli Finkel, who I think you had mentioned too, some of his work. So they do work on polarization that has this relationship kind of focus, and that could be something interesting. Another person that do you know the Strengthening Democracy project? Are you familiar with this?
I've heard the name. I don't know much about it.
Yeah. So it was a big almost like a contest, I guess, where they invited academics to submit their best bet for interventions to reduce polarization, right? Or to
Really?
do something. Yeah. So this would be something right up your alley, I expect. And Rob Willer is one of the leads of this. But basically, they just did this huge competition. Everybody could submit their thing. There were a number of criteria. So it had to be something that you could deliver online. It had to be relatively short, like 8 minutes or less, and that sort of thing. It had to not involve any deception. And then they picked the 25 best, or the 25 they thought would be best. And then they did a huge online study where they randomly assigned people to get these various interventions, both on the left and the right, and then looked at which ones were most successful. So you could actually go online, you can find the rankings of these. And some of the ones that were most successful, I think, are really, interesting to think about if you're actually, interested in ways that political polarization could potentially get addressed. And I don't remember if this was the absolute top one, but I'm pretty sure the person that I'm thinking of is Julia Minson. I'm pretty sure that's the name. And she was, I went to a talk recently that was talking about this whole project. And so one of the absolute top winners of reducing polarization, increasing kind of like willingness to think about the other side as human, reducing animosity, was showing people, of all things, a Heineken ad. I don't know if you remember this Heineken ad from a few years ago, but it was an ad where they'd bring these people together from different political parties. So they had like an anti-feminist and a really strong feminist together. They had somebody who had sort of anti-trans kinds of attitudes with a trans woman. And a number of others, somebody who was really against the idea, like didn't believe climate change was happening, with somebody who is an environmental activist. Does this ring a bell to you at all? Do you remember this?
Vaguely. I want to say I saw one with a farmer and a non-farmer, but I could be
Yeah. So what they did in the ad was people didn't know that they had these different opinions. They interviewed people in advance, and they found out all of this stuff. They had little videos of them talking about their attitudes, but they're challenged during this. This is just a commercial, right? So you can watch this commercial online, but this commercial has people come together and they're working on a common project. So it's almost like, working on an IKEA piece of furniture together, but they have instructions in front of them. They have to be building this thing. So they're working together, they're building this thing, they're having conversations about their task. They're learning a little bit about each other. They're having some kind of get to know you chat. And at the very end of this short commercial, they see all of these people working together, and they've managed to build what really is kind of like benches and a bar. So, and the bar, of course, because it's a beer commercial, the bar, they put these two Heinekens down on the bar, and they then get them to watch a video of the person talking about all of their attitudes, right? So suddenly the trans woman learns that the other guy has anti-trans attitudes, or the person finds out that they think that feminism is cancer, like all of this kind of stuff, right? And then the task at the end of the video is, okay, well, you've just been working together on this goal with this person, you've gotten to know them and all this kind of stuff. And so now the question is, do you want to walk away after finding out what this person actually believes, or do you want to sit down at the bar and have a beer and talk things out, right? And of course, this could all be staged, but in the video, everybody ends up sitting down and talking things out. So it's kind of this hopeful message about how, maybe we can actually see past each other's differences and come to some common understanding, and maybe even change a few minds in the meantime. And so this was something that they showed people as a possible intervention. And it had pretty dramatic effects on how people felt about those on the other side, and how, how polarized they were. And, so I'll end on that, because I think it's both an interesting intervention approach and something you might want to look into, and because it also suggests something that is a little bit more scalable, right? So telling these kinds of stories in media is one way of getting these messages to more people, right? Rather than just trying to, get every two people into a room and trying to do this contact stuff and everything else. It's a more scalable kind of approach.
And I think the program is Strengthening Democracy Challenge.org, Winning Interventions, Strengthening Democracy Challenge info, and the name of the study was Mega Study Identifying Effective Interventions to Strengthen America's Democratic Attitudes. Some of the people on the board, Julie Ronkowski is well known. Jesse Shapiro is also known in this space. Neil Malhotra is also well known. Liliana Mason is super famous. Let's see here. Eli Finkel, Matt Genskow, Peter Ditto, and of course Chris Bale. So a lot of big names, and that's on top of Rob Willard. So I didn't even know about that. Thank you so much. I didn't even know about that. Big resource. This has been a great interview. I didn't even know about that, and I really appreciate the recommendation of Amy Gordon. I didn't even know that. We'll leave it there. Was there anything you felt you didn't get the chance to say, something you wanted to say, a topic you wanted to cover, you felt you didn't get the opportunity, Professor?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground.
Okay. We'll leave it there. I want to say thank you for coming out. Thank you for being blunt and honest and helping the public understand kind of where the field is at right now. I really appreciate it. And I will send you a copy of the video very shortly.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Talk to you.
I'll email you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.